Hello and welcome to Rights and Recourse, a program that tackles constitutional, human rights and legal issues, bringing you information and analysis. My name is Dumile Mateza. Remember, you can also be part of our discussion today by calling our studio line on 011 714 5497 or 5498 or tweet us at Rights and Recourse. Alternatively, you can email your thoughts to rightsandrecourse@sabc.co.za. German dramatist and author Bertolt Brecht wrote, and I quote, "This is the year which people will talk about. This is the year which people will be silent about. The old will see the young die. The foolish see the wise die. The earth no longer produces, it devours. The sky hurls down, no rain, only iron." Close quote. This year, Steve Bantu Biko would have been 71 years old. Steve Biko died in a detention in South Africa in 1977. Critical ethical issues are raised both by the conduct of the doctors responsible for Biko's care and the subsequent response of the medical profession as a whole. Because those issues are relevant to all healthcare professionals everywhere, the Biko affair provides a useful case study in medical ethics. Today on Rights and Recourse, we take a look at the ethical conduct of the doctors who treated him and who should bear the legal liability for his death in detention. But first, let's have a look at this insert.
In his short lifetime, Steve Biko became known as the father of black consciousness.
Any changes which are to come can only come as a result of a program worked out by black people. And for black people to be able to work out a program, they need to defeat the one main element in politics which was working against them, and this was a psychological feeling of inferiority.
The history of the last decade of the struggle for liberation would probably have been different had he not died in 1977. On the 18th of August, Biko ignored his banning orders and drove to a political meeting. He was arrested at a roadblock and taken to the Sanlam building in Port Elizabeth. He was kept naked and in chains in room 619. Biko sustained serious head injuries during interrogation. In that state, and still naked, probably to humiliate him, he was taken by police van to Pretoria. Steve Biko died naked and on the metal grill on September 14, 1977. The Minister of Police, Jimmy Kruger, immediately told the world Biko had died after a hunger strike. He later changed that and explained that he had banged his head against a wall. He told an amused National Party Congress, "I am not glad and I am not sorry about Mr. Biko. It leaves me cold." The SABC and the Afrikaans press mounted a propaganda campaign to counter the widely held view that Biko was killed by his interrogators. After an inquest that became the laughing stock of the international judicial community, Magistrate Martinus Prins determined that nobody could be held responsible for Biko's death.
The voice there of Max de Prieur was producer of SABC program that looked at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. To discuss today's topic, we are joined in the studio by Professor Ames Dye, Director of the Steve Biko Center for Bioethics at Wits University, Mr. Murray Hawthorne, an attorney at the Weber Wenzel, and lastly, we are joined in our Durban studio by Dr. Seth Cooper, President of the Pan-African Psychology Union. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to Rights and Recourse.
Good afternoon. Thank you.
Let me start with you, Dr. Seth Cooper down in Durban. Am I right in the belief that Steve Biko's death continues to have serious consequences for the medical profession in South Africa?
Absolutely, and I think that the medical profession has done something to ensure that ethics is a key part of our continuing licensing and registration, but I think we have not gone far enough as health professionals to ensure that the kinds of things that happened to Biko 40 years ago do not happen and continue to happen. But sadly, there are cases like the Esidimeni case, which shows that there's callousness and disregard. And largely, I think there's a defensiveness from people in authority to account, and we seem to be going backwards in many respects when we deal with bureaucrats who tend to defend the indefensible.
Professor Dye, what are the protocols involved in a medical practitioner when requested to examine or treat a prisoner in incarceration, or a patient for that matter?
So I think first and foremost it's important to look at the human side of the patient, and so I think that would be an unwritten protocol. In terms of medical ethics, it's very important to approach the patient with care and compassion. It's important to take informed consent from the patient prior to instituting any management, and it's very, very important to keep the the confidentiality, to protect the confidentiality of the patient. I want to go back to care and compassion. It's very, very, very important that when you actually look at the patient, you look at that human being in front of you, and to quote Steve's words, the human face in front of you.
The issues around ethics are you heard Mr. Hawthorne, you heard Dr. Seth Cooper down in Durban talking about raising the issue of isidimeni, and if there should be, there is going to be an investigation, I understand, besides the investigation of the Ombud, but if there should there be legal liability in this case? We've seen a lot of medical legal issues coming before courts in South Africa.
Esodomeni. Are you talking of esodomeni?
Esodomeni and any other medical legal issue that has come before the courts in South Africa.
Well, of course, there are two potential liabilities. The one is a criminal liability, and the other would be a civil liability for damages on behalf of either the dependents, if there were dependents of those persons, or family members for emotional trauma. Those would be the two basic liabilities which might arise. I understand, though, that in the Esodomeni matter, the state or the ministry has accepted wrongdoing. So it's a matter of settling the size of the damages to be paid out. That's what I understand, but I might be quite
briefly,
wrong.
Professor Dye, Dr. Cooper mentioned the Esodomeni issue. We seem to have learned very little from an extensive and very wide investigation of the Biko case in the inquest, for instance.
Absolutely. When you look at Steve Biko, his rights were trampled upon. He was actually terrorized, and herded onto a truck, soaked in urine, some kilometers away, a long distance away. You look at Life Isidimeni, and you look at these patients that were in Life Isidimeni. What's different? They were herded onto trucks like cattle on vans and taken to non-government so-called NGOs, which professed to have facilities but did not. But the decision by the Gauteng Department of Health was made on narrow economic reasons rather than humanitarian ones. So, you ask yourself, what's different? In terms of how one should respond to this, the healthcare professionals that actually authorize the Life Isidimeni move need to have their licenses withdrawn. So, there has to be a case up at Health Professions Council. What about the number of patients that died as well?
Briefly, Dr. Seth Cooper, the issue of Life Isidimeni, which we are going to revisit at some time when we take a complete look at how mental health is looked at in South Africa. It would seem to me, as I said to Professor Dye here, we have not learned our lessons from the Steve Biko days.
No, we haven't, and this is why perhaps we're doing this program, Dumile, because if we had a dispensation that actually even paid some lip service to our human rights dispensation, we wouldn't be in the state that we're in. Almost every other week we hear of atrocities committed somewhere in the healthcare system, and the way that the healthcare system is approached, we're just talking about numbers, we're talking about statistics. The human being, as Professor Dai correctly pointed out, the human being, the human body and face is lost in this process. And the terrible thing is, we have a black democratic government, and the ones suffering the most are black African majority patients who don't have the ability to pay for the services that are offered that the upper middle class can afford to pay. So there is a serious discrimination happening, and when it comes to mental illness and any such disorders and behavioral problems, they are worse off in the pecking order. And internationally, the Special Rapporteur for Mental Health has commented about this year, not at any other time. And I think it's about time that we revisited the appalling conditions in our mental health institutions. I remember when Manto Chabalala Msimang was the minister, she commented that it was appalling. Since then, some changes have happened, but many of us will be really shocked if we visited these facilities. We don't deserve this. In the 21st century, with the kinds of resources that we have, with the kinds of professional skills, our people deserve much better. And at the bottom, there needs to be a recognition of their basic human rights.
Obviously, we will revisit the issue of mental health care on this program sometime during the course of the year. But first of all, let us concentrate, or let us put our focus on the Steve Biko inquest. Mr. Hawthorne, South African law says if a person dies under conditions that are unnatural, there must be an inquest. What is the role of an inquest? Could you remind us?
Well, yeah, let me just give you a bit of a background to that. In terms of the Births and Deaths Registration Act, upon the death of any person, the body must be examined by a medical practitioner. Either, if you have medical aid, I suppose, by your private doctor or by the district surgeon, or by take the body to a hospital and have it examined. The doctor then is required to make a determination as to whether the death was by natural causes or not. If it was by natural causes, the doctor must issue a certificate to that effect, and then the normal processes following a death can follow: burial, cremation, administration of the estate of the deceased person. If the doctor believes and states that the death was by unnatural causes, then the doctor must refer it to the South African police, who would then open a case, and they're obliged to investigate. The police would then refer the matter to the prosecution authority. If the prosecution authority decides to prosecute anybody as a result, in respect of that death, then that must follow, the law would follow its course. If the prosecuting authority decides not to prosecute, for whatever reason, insufficiency of evidence and so on, then the prosecuting authority is required to refer the case to the magistrate for the district concerned to conduct an inquest. So that's how one gets to the inquest. Yeah.
Dr. Kuba, I want to come to you quickly before I come back to Professor Dai. In the case of Steve Biko, there was all of these steps are really steps that are legal steps that are followed in a normal case. In South Africa, of course, at the time, the Steve Biko inquest was because of the huge international pressure and local pressure by people here in South Africa.
Yes, look, I think that what Mr. Hawthorne has presented is in a normal society. We're still very much an abnormal society, coming from the abnormality of apartheid. Clearly, Magistrate Prince's findings were totally off point, And a case that we should refer to now is the Timol inquest being reopened. We know that Judge Boshoff reopened the case of the doctors, the 3 doctors in the Massa matter, as well as the then Medical and Dental Council, now Health Professions Council, and ordered them to look at the conduct of the doctors. I know Judge Boshoff, he convicted me. I was sentenced to 6 years in prison. And he was forced, because of the weight of evidence that was brought by the chair of Ames Dye's unit, Professor Variava, Francis, and others from Cape Town, medical practitioners, that the conduct case was reopened and Masaf made very reluctantly a finding. You see, when it comes to very powerful professions, the legal profession is very powerful, politicians, judges, and so on. Second to that is the medical profession. And then comes the audit profession. These are very powerful professions, and particularly when it comes to life and death matters, medical doctors hold the future of your well-being at hand. And even the most educated amongst us are afraid to go against the doctor. And what often happens is we tend to gang up. We tend to close ranks against the others, the public, when any of us is under scrutiny. And it's about time that we stopped defending the indefensible. I think with the Timol inquest findings, and I think the judge will make his findings within the space of a few weeks, the BICO inquest is likely to be reopened because there are huge gaps in the evidence chain and in the total discrepancy between what the forensic evidence from the medical practitioners was and the testimony given by the doctors and his incarcerators. I think there's going to be serious legal liability, and I think the state at this stage is very worried because it has inherited the burden of apartheid atrocity, and it has forgotten that the TRC findings are still to be continued with, and there are various cases that are coming up. So our state, our government, particularly with the malaise in leadership, needs to wake up and acknowledge the past. Maybe we can have a better moral dispensation if some of those on high forgot their own malpractices and unethical conduct and focused on what they should focus, protection of the public.
Well, if you'd like to join us in today's discussion, you can call us at 011 714 5497 or 5498 or tweet us at Rights Recourse. Alternatively, you can email your thoughts to rightsandrecourse@sabc.co.za. Stay with us.
Phones, cloud systems and robots have taken over a lot of what used to be done manually.
Our accounting system is actually based on the cloud.
Google nowadays can tell you where you parked your car.
And Africa's entrepreneurs are using technology to create.
With Pocket Maskwala, you can basically do all the services that you would do at the municipality physically by going there, but you can now do them on a mobile app.
Join me, Spumelele Zondi, on Sundays at 9 p.m. on SABC News.
The issues at the inquest. First, the police denied throughout that Biko had been assaulted. Consequently, much of the police evidence was directed to finding some cause for his brain injuries which did not incriminate them. The second issue was the manner in which Steve Biko was treated throughout his detention. On the first issue, there was a story to which all the officers adhered as best they could. On the morning of the 7th, this was the evidence, Biko was taken from the mat on which he'd lain at night under guard and in shackles, and was taken to the investigation room. There he was seated on a chair, and when the major who was in charge of the investigation began to question him, he sprang up and attacked the major with such fury that it took a captain who was also present and 3 other officers to subdue him. In the course of this violent struggle, it was said, he must have bumped his head on the wall and fallen to the floor, but he was fighting furiously throughout, and after he was brought under control, he was taken back to the mat where he was again placed in leg irons. And the police maintained that this head bump against the wall was the cause of all the brain injuries found post-mortem.
Well, that is Sir Sidney Kendridge, QC, who represented the Biko family at the inquest. Now, Professor, it is improbable to blame the doctors for everything that went wrong. Dr. Kataka requested that Mr. Biko be admitted to a hospital and was not fit to travel by road to Pretoria. It would seem that the police left for Pretoria anyway without the knowledge of the doctors. What did they know?
Well, in my mind, I think they would have known, because these were doctors that were employed by the previous dispensation, and they were being salaried by that dispensation. And so they would have done what their employers wanted them to do. And even if it means that they conspired and were silent, you know, the conspiracy of silence, that's the situation. Now, what should they have done? They should have gone back to the oaths that they'd taken on graduation, whereby the interests of the patient would be of paramount importance. They found themselves in a situation of dual loyalty. Okay, loyalty to my employer, which is the government of the day, or loyalty to my patient. And in a case of the medical profession, it's your loyalty to your patient that is first and foremost. What happens when you find yourself in a situation of dual loyalty? It's very important to actually verbalize the situation, take the situation outside your situation of dual loyalty. Go to your associations. But even if they went to their association, the Medical Association of South Africa was colluding with the government at that stage as well. They could have even gone international, but they chose to remain quiet. And this is where we come in with our students. As far as us, you know, in terms of our teaching, you're not just the doctor of the patient or the healthcare practitioner for the patient. You're the patient's advocate. And they did not understand their advocacy role.
The other question, obviously, Professor Dye here touched on an issue that I touched on earlier, where district surgeons are employees then. District surgeons were employees of the state. And it is therefore not surprising that their activities were to promote the interest of the state.
Well, they certainly ought not to have been, because, I mean, the district surgeon is there in the police context. The police, as soon as a prisoner is injured, I think it would be the duty of the police to call the district surgeon to attend to the person and to have them removed to hospital if necessary, to call an ambulance and remove them to hospital. So in a sense, I think it's intended to be a guarantee of medical assistance for any prisoner, that there is a district surgeon to call upon, and the police will be obliged to do so immediately. Question in Biko, and I don't know the details, is whether they did, whether, you know, when he had been seriously injured. Maybe not.
No, they did not.
Well, that is a grave infraction of their duties in itself, of course.
Dr. Cooper, responding to what Mr. Hawthorne is saying, I picked up at some stage probably also this issue that Professor Dye is talking about. It also seemed that the identity of Steve Biko was concealed when he was taken to a hospital. Apparently, the lawyers picked up that he was called Stephen Jello, so that the people around the hospital should not pick up this was Steve Biko they were bringing into the hospital, and the doctors played along with that.
Well, look, I know that from my own case. And remember, the testimony that Steve Biko gives in the movie Cry Freedom was in my trial, the SABC trial. And I know what they used to do. They used to ensure that the people transporting you, the people taking you between the cells and whichever facility, would be senior and usually white officers. So in that apartheid era, we were treated quite differently from the run-of-the-mill prisoner, and we should not forget that you would not have been appointed a medical officer in the state service, especially a district surgeon or a senior one at that, without being loyal to the apartheid state. We should not just continue as if all things were equal. Lawyers, judges, the judiciary, the medical profession, indeed all aspects of society were under that pall of apartheid domination. And indeed, many of them actually supported actively apartheid by supporting their behavior in deed and in word. So it's a little rich for Tucker and Lang to claim ignorance, because they fully well knew what was happening. And if they stood their ground saying this patient must receive attention, that power that I referred to that the judiciary and medical professionals have would have prevailed, because the apartheid ethic was, well, so-and-so who's a judge or a magistrate has spoken and we will obey it. We don't like to, but we will. Or the doctor, the medical district surgeon has said, and therefore we will do. I've been in that context where reluctantly they took me after torture and so on. But the medical officer in that context made a script and said, you must give this patient the script, and I got the medication. So I think we're not dealing with equality here, as Ames Dye has said. There was serious dual loyalty. Indeed, I believe there was singular loyalty to the apartheid state because they believed in the superiority of what they were putting out. So it would help us if the public interest sections of big firms like Weber Wenzel, Bowman's, and so on were to take on this kind of case and say, we're going to take it up instead of the families, the nephew of Timol taking it up, or Nkosinathi Biko and Mrs. Biko taking up that case. I think the challenge is now to our legal firms, like the challenge is to the KPMGs of this world. Are you going to stand up on the side of right, or are you going to continue to remain aloof from what is happening around us? Because our system is seriously compromised, and we require bold, brave leadership to stand up and say, we believe in our human rights dispensation, and not in our watch will such things ever happen again.
Let's take this call from Namibia, from DD. Good afternoon and welcome to Rights and Recourse.
Yes, good afternoon to you. How are you doing?
Yes. We lost you there, or you have your TV on or something.
No, it is off now. It is off now.
Yes.
Good afternoon there.
Good afternoon.
And your guest in the studio as well. It's Biko from Namibia. I feel the same that still Biko, we must start mentioning the couplet of those crime organizers to kill Stephen Biko. Honestly speaking, we cannot keep our leaders who are supposed to inspire us in a manner that it's fair. Then today we lose them. We lose Stephen Biko. We lose Chris Hani. similar way to those who are oppressing us. Because they are cowards, they are running to South Africa, they escape us from Namibia to run to South Africa.
Peggy D, I don't know, I didn't hear part of what you were saying, but I think the viewers must have heard you. Professor Dye, what was the state of the South African medical profession during apartheid that, despite the emphatic Tokyo Declaration of 1975, whose preamble reads, and I quote, "It is a privilege of the medical doctor to practice medicine in the service of humanity to preserve and restore bodily and mental health without distinction as to the persons, to comfort and to ease the suffering of his or her patient"?
Well, the situation was that while South African doctors took oaths, and I took my oath at that time as well.
At the time?
Yes. In the main, they were white South African doctors, and they paid lip service to their oaths. Because if they actually truly believed in the oaths that they were taking, we would not have had the Steve Biko and others incidents as well.
If we ask quickly, I'm sorry to interrupt, what is the difference between the Tokyo Declaration of 1975 and the Hippocratic Oath?
So the Hippocratic Oath is over 2,000 years old, okay, and it is the international oath that was put together by Hippocrates. Because they felt even at that time that there was a need to inculcate an ethos of ethics amongst the medical professionals. Now, the Tokyo Declaration is a declaration that was put together by the World Medical Association. And the World Medical Association is an international association made up of a number of national medical associations. Currently, they stand at about 111. What it meant was that if you were a member of a national medical association, then you would have had to actually you practice in accordance with the declarations that came out of the World Medical Association. Now, the situation with the Medical Association of South Africa is the World Medical Association actually started a process whereby they got the Medical Association of South Africa out of the World Medical Association, and that was because of the apartheid policies in this country.
Were the doctors in a position, Mr. Hawthorne, to actually persuade the security police, Colonel Hoerson at the time, Port Elizabeth, that Steve Biko needed to be hospitalized in a proper hospital with proper doctors? But
I believe it was within their power to ensure that he was hospitalized, to demand it, to ensure it, and that it should have happened. Just as a matter of interest, my firm acted for the Timol family in this latest inquest.
I wanted to ask you about that. I want to come to that.
But I do think that the doctors had the power to do that, and ought to have done so. And if they didn't, I'm not aware, insofar in the Timol matter, of course, Professor Salim Esop was very seriously, well, a number of detainees in that grouping were seriously tortured. He had to be rushed to hospital on the verge of death on the day before Timol's death. And to the credit of the district surgeon, that's why it was the district surgeon who ensured that he was taken to hospital. And I'm sure that the district surgeon's conduct is not entirely above reproach in that matter, but he did at least do that. Well, and he was treated, and Dr. Esop has fortunately lived a long and productive life.
Well, we'll come to that when we talk about the reluctance of the Medical Association and the South African Medical and Dental Council to take action against the doctors, which needed other doctors to fight the cause of the doctors and other people. Dr. Cooper, it is difficult to ask about ethical questions, the ethical conduct of the doctors during the apartheid era, when apartheid itself was a crime against humanity according to the United Nations. Do we expect too much from these doctors?
Well, no. I think that, and Ames Dye has referred to the centuries-old Hippocratic Oath. And Mr. Hawthorne has referred to the rights of these medical practitioners, and if they insisted on patient care. Therefore, despite the prevailing ethos, those doctors needed to stand up because they were dealing with a vulnerable, molested patient. And the clip that you showed with Sidney Kentridge talking of the inquest and what was said during the inquest, I can well imagine Steve, because he was very prescient, and almost weeks before this sad, terrible death that he had, he said, if you come to me, I will defend myself. So I can imagine that he did defend himself in that police cell in Port Elizabeth, not in the way that they presented, but they probably ganged up on him. And while they said there were 3 or so officers, I would like to believe that there were many, many more, like many of us confronted. You did not confront 1 or 2 or 3 of them. You confronted a horde of them, and they rushed at you. It was simply inconceivable that 3 or 4 people would be unable to restrain such a person. Indeed, there must have been an orgy of attack on Steve, such that none of them could have helped such an attack, and merely claiming that it was his head banging against a wall to cause the series of brain trauma that he underwent and succumbed to. So I think, coming back to it, yes, we have power. Those of us who work for the state, and I'm pleased to say that young professionals in various arms of the state. I gave a talk on ethics a while ago to the military psychologists, and they raised these questions. These are our children who are now practicing out there, and hopefully they will not defend our state come right or wrong. It's for the officers in charge, the judicial officers, the officers of the court, the medical professionals and others to stand up and say, my constitution protects me, unlike in the apartheid era, and I will stand with those rights against any opdracht, against any instruction, or against any fear. And that our courts, our legal system should and must protect them.
Well, if you'd like to join us in today's discussion, you can still call us on 011 714 5497 or 5498, or call us or tweet us at Recourse. You can continue tweeting on the subject. We're going to continue when we come back. We'll look at very carefully at the case of the South African Medical and Dental Council and the Medical Association of South Africa when we come back.
Those who tortured and beat Steve Biko up in jail and killed him so heartlessly, you all would recall that he was driven comatose from Port Elizabeth, naked, in the back of a Land Rover, all the way to Pretoria. where he was shackled to a grate and left to expire, sitting in his urine, and left to die a death that Mr. Jimmy Kruger said left him cold. Phew. They had hoped that would be the end, the inglorious, shameful end of someone they considered a pretty handful. They hoped he would be snuffed out like you blow out a candle, annihilated, and that would be that. They were doomed to fail.
While Archbishop Emeritus Bishop Tutu there also giving a lecture on the Steve Biko, in the life of Steve Biko. Professor Dye, in a response to a letter authored by Professor Hoffenberger in the British Medical Journal of January 28, 1978, the then General Secretary of MARSA, Professor C.M. Viljoen, expresses the view that the doctors should be given the benefits of the doubt. And I quote, "It cannot be expected of a professional body like MARSA to express an opinion regarding the medical treatment received by the late Mr. Steve Biko on the basis of newspaper reports. It would be highly improper to do so, as the matter is still sub judice." But were these issues not ventilated at the inquest in 1977?
Absolutely. You know, it's very, very clear that the president of the MARSA at that stage was...
But he was the Secretary General.
The Secretary General. Secretary General, whatever, but you know. Yes. Actually was captured, to use that term, by the apartheid government. Because for him to make a statement like that was absolutely ludicrous. You know, and it you know, what's so clear is the type of apartheid medicine that we had before 94. And basically what he was doing was defending the government of the day. So he himself had forgotten the oath that he had taken. And when you actually look at the situation now, and you look at the Life Isidimeni, we had doctors agreeing to do what the MEC of Health in Gauteng had done at that stage. And she had made the decision that the patients had to be moved out of Life Isidimeni. And these doctors then went in defense of her and didn't speak out against her as the state at the stage. And I come back to my question and ask, what actually has changed?
Mr. Hawthorne, there is this loose use, it's done even today, this use of the term sub judice. And Professor Viljoen also goes on to say the doctors are innocent, were innocent until proven guilty. That's another one that's being thrown around from time to time, which we meet every day in South Africa.
Well, presumably,
what is sub judice, and what is the meaning of sub judice in this sense?
Well, I think that the meaning of sub judice has been greatly restricted in recent years. I'm not an expert on this issue, but it seems to me that obviously now all court proceedings after the inception of a case are public documents and can be freely quoted in the newspapers. That did not used to be the case. There are some exceptions, for example, marital in divorce cases, which I think, you know, those remain sub judice. The rule applies. Probably sub judice really applies to an attempt to improperly influence a judgment, you know, that you can't do that.
Well, these days we normally talk about, or will talk about this case without making reference to the issues that are being discussed in the case. We normally say that.
I beg your pardon, Doctor.
What I'm saying, we normally say we are going to talk about the case, to get over this sub judice rule. So we are going to talk about the case without talking about the merits of the case.
Well, I think you can talk about the merits of the case, provided you do so in a balanced way, and not in a way which is designed to influence or to pull the wool over the eyes, in particular, of the judge who might be reading your or looking at your program. And he's also tasked with making a judgment. That I think goes. I think that there the sub judice rule, perhaps it's a contempt of court rule, in fact, is being encroached.
Dr. Cooper, in a startling admission by Dr. Tarka, he told the inquest that the Hippocratic Oath had a bearing on his ethical conduct, but his conduct was actually governed by the rules of the South African Medical and Dental Council.
No, nothing can be further from the truth. You know, there's a higher moral order that all of us who are health professionals, all of us who are legal practitioners, all of us who have a certain ethical comeback have, and that is to follow the ethics of that profession. But having said that, we must understand that during the apartheid era, the ruling ethic was apartheid rather than medical or health professional ethics, and indeed legal ethics were practiced in the lip service. So all aspects of our behavior were subsumed under the apartheid ethic. Having said that, I must give one example which will illustrate some of the difficulties that we're dealing with. In the 2000 period, I was an executive member of the Health Professions Council, and sitting there was Surgeon General Knobel, Dr. Knobel, who was the handler of Dr. Evil Waterbeson, and he was the chair of one of the 4 preliminary committees in the medical profession. And we wanted to know what was happening with the complaints raised, and he said it was sub judice, trotted out as an excuse. Thankfully, our courts have gone far beyond that. Many of our judges have allowed cameras into the evidence room, into the trials. So saying that they're unlikely to be influenced by whatever happens out there. And that's the real principled judicial officer saying, I'm not going to take what happens, and if Dumile has a program that's going to discuss this case that is in people's mind, I'm going to apply the law. That is what is required. So the doctor who said his calling as a person giving the oath is subsumed under certain other rules really cannot hold in the current day. It may have held during the apartheid era, but in the current period it will certainly not hold water, and therefore there's a serious case to be answered by such doctors, and indeed by those policemen who have themselves come to testify at the TRC and were giving evidence at the inquest, like has happened in the Timol inquest. So if there is a reopening of the Biko case, I'm pretty certain there will be lots of heads to roll, including those who protected, and they could be in office now or they could be retired, but in a sense they need to account. There's another example, and that is during the apartheid atrocities, there were military conscripts. And Aubrey Levine, as a psychiatrist, he was the superintendent of Tara psychiatric facility in Sandton, where I did an itinerant internship. He, 2 years ago, was arraigned in Canada, and I think he's still serving a sentence in Canada for abusing his male patients. Ironically, he was the guy who was trying to desensitize gay military conscripts so that they could not continue their sexual orientation. Whereas I think he was trying to hide his own sexual inadequacy. But we need to see an example made of doctors here. Remember that the Holocaust Center pursues people all over the world. And sometimes we look at the accused and say, this man is 80 years old. But they pursue it on principle. And it's not for retribution. It is more so that we don't fall into the traps of the past and justify anything beyond our ethical calling. That's the simple question that we need to be very clear about.
Well, we had a call on the line. Mzwanele, my apologies. We can't take that call because I want us to pass on something. Professor, in the light of the inquest and what came out of the inquest, it would seem to be the Medical Association of South Africa and the South African Medical and Dental Council were reluctant to take actions against the doctors. What happened then? In my view, it should not matter what the circumstances lead to the misdemeanor of a professional body like the Medical Association of South Africa. It is obliged to investigate and to institute an investigation into the conduct of professionals.
Well, you know, it is because of doctors who recognized the importance of their calling that they were actually then forced to have an investigation. And, you know, the case of Veriava versus the South African Medical and Dental Council, the judgment for that case was that the Medical and Dental Council had to actually do an investigation. So I think this was a period of 6 years in which the doctors struggled. And just to name a few, there was Professor Joe Veriava, there was Trevor Jenkins, and Francis Ames, so it wasn't black-white. It was even white doctors that felt passionate about it because they knew and they understood their calling. There was the investigation, and unfortunately the investigation was done by a captured South African Medical and Dental Council. And yes, the doctors were found guilty and were just given a rap on the knuckles.
I just want to get to something to Mr. Hawthorne. Mr. Hawthorne, even if in an inquest, even if I would imagine, even if the magistrate says, who's in charge of the inquest, says no one can be blamed, using George Bezos's book title of this inquest, surely there must be issues that can be followed up, as Professor Dr. Cooper has said.
Yes, well, of course, the likelihood is that if the inquest says no one is to blame, the prosecuting authority is unlikely to take it much further in the nature of things. I imagine, yes. They would tend to say, well, that's that one done, put it at the bottom of the drawer, I imagine. That's one thing. But one can reopen an inquest on good evidence, which is what happened in the Timor inquest. Yes, because really the family, the nephew Imtiaz Kaji, he drove further investigation. He was a young 5-year-old boy when his uncle died, and a lot of similar fact evidence, I think. That the magistrate found that Timor was unharmed. In fact, his finding is entirely contradictory. On the one hand, he found that Timor was harmed, but in a brawl before he was brought in. On the other hand, he finds that Timor was entirely unharmed, because that is what the police officer said, that he was entirely unarmed and unharmed, and he decided to jump out of the window and commit suicide. But it was really, I think the tipping point was the evidence of Dr. Aesop, who had been arrested with Ahmed Timor on that Friday night, and he was working with Timor in distributing Communist Party literature, which of course was a criminal offense in those days. And it's really the evidence of what happened to him, which he has not spoken about fully and openly for many years, which tipped the balance and which caused the inquest to be reopened. That it led to the NDPP recommending to the minister that the inquest be reopened, the minister agreeing, and the minister then asking the judge president to appoint a judge to preside at a second inquest.
Well, it's a very fascinating discussion here. We haven't scratched the tip of the iceberg, and there's a lot more underneath the iceberg that we need to get to. Doctors Jenkins and McLean ends their paper with a conclusion, and I quote, "There is no reason to suppose that the BICO doctors or the members of the professional bodies who turned a blind eye to their misconduct were moral monsters. They were ordinary people who had allowed their moral sense and their medical professionalism to be undermined by the corrupting attitudes reinforced by the custom and habit. The profession of medicine is characterized by a very specific relation between doctor and patient, a relationship founded upon the doctor's commitment to provide uncompromised medical care. The BICO affair stands as a reminder to all individual doctors and to the guardians of their profession of how vigilant they must be if this commitment is to be kept intact." This has been Rights and Recourse. The views expressed in this program are not necessarily those of the SABC or Rights and Recourse. This program is repeated at 5 on Monday morning. Join us again next week when we'll be bringing you the history and the legacy of the Afrikaner Broederbond. If you didn't know about state capture, that will be a real state capture story. From all of us, goodbye.